Okay. I'm going to give everybody a second to all get logged in. But I would like to say welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you with us today for another great Connectionology webinar. As you know, my name is Ginger. I'm the Executive Director of Connectionology. And all of you guys know John Romano. This has been his brainchild since 2012. He loves teaching, and that's how Connectionology all got started. I know we have like a lot of new attorneys watching, and we like to welcome you. We've been doing these webinars now since April 2020, and we're going to continue doing them because you guys have been enjoying them so much. If you go to the Connectionology YouTube channel, you can find some additional videos that we've done. And then stay tuned to our website, connectionology.com, because you can keep an eye out for all of our live seminars that are happening. We have one coming up in September in Fort Worth, which is going to be all about deposition skills, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So consider coming to that and joining us. Later on in this webinar, you're going to meet our fantastic partners that we work with over at HMR, Fox AE, as well as On Point Legal Nurse Consulting. We are so grateful to all three of our partners because they've helped us continue to do these webinars for all of you, and they're such huge supporters of us. So thank you for supporting them too. Now let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to tell you, if you have any questions, we would like to ask them throughout the webinar. You can definitely put those in the Q&A box for Kyle. And speaking of Kyle, we are excited to have him back because he is our great moderator today. He has been the Chief Revenue Officer for HMR, and he manages a lot of their sales operations around the country and for the organization. And he currently oversees the daily operations of business that is done in over 39 states now, which is where they currently operate. And then Kyle has also been with HMR since 2012, and he has been in the medical funding space for well over 16 years. He's had the opportunity to fund several thousand cases with a primary concentration on funding TBI and catastrophic injury cases for plaintiffs who are uninsured. Does that and so much more, you guys. So I encourage you to stay in touch with Kyle well beyond this webinar because he's such a great person to know, and he's got a fantastic team. So I'm happy we got the gang back together today. We're going to be talking all about TBI. We're going to be learning some new things. I hope that you enjoy this webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kyle now.
Hey, thanks so much, Ginger. It's so great to be back with everybody again. I know it was wonderful seeing everybody in Nashville. Such a great program. Looking forward to Fort Worth. But excited to be here today. So, you know, most people who are tuning in have heard Hugo speak on several different topics. And so today we're coming right back at everybody again with more information regarding traumatic brain injury cases. Today's topic, we're going to be covering the use of MEG imaging. It's a very long word that I'm going to let Hugo go ahead and pronounce for everybody. But the way we're going to run the format today is just like the previous ones. We're going to encourage people to ask questions along the way. You can put them in the Q&A or the chat box, and we want this to remain, you know, kind of an interactive program. And so we'll try to answer the questions in real time and kind of pause when we think it's appropriate. So with that being said, for those who don't know, I'm going to introduce you to Hugo Chanez. Hugo is a partner at Mitchell Sanchez in New Orleans, Louisiana. He's practiced law in the United Kingdom. He's a fellow of the American Board of Trial Advocates. He's got a national practice where he prosecutes several large catastrophic injury cases around the country. He's actively in Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, California, and several other states. He's had many multi-million-dollar results from the cases he's been involved in. And this platform specifically seems to have really been good for people to come and seek his expertise in the space of traumatic brain injury and trial law in general. So I'm excited to have my good friend back. And Hugo, I'm going to turn it over to you, bud.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Ginger, for the invitation. I always love working with you guys. So this idea came out of a conversation that Kyle and I had about the difficulties of traumatic brain injuries and how we have to find different ways to sort of prove our cases. Ultimately, the premise we have as plaintiffs lawyers is the same. We have a client that is injured, and we have to do the best job we can for them so that they can obtain the medical services they need, the compensation they need, and get their lifestyle back to normal as much as possible. But, as we all know, in our way stands a defense lawyer and insurance company whose job is to basically derail our client's recovery. So that's why we get together and we do these seminars to find new ways to prove our cases and to get our clients the help that they need. So one of the topics that has come up recently, it's called a MEG in short. If you want, the full name is magnetoencephalography. So it's a brain imaging technique, and it's great for mild TBI cases. So again, if you have a severe TBI, a moderate TBI, you're probably not going to need this as much. But we do know from the statistics in the country that the majority of TBIs are mild TBIs. And we know from the literature that you can hear it in every case with defense lawyers and their experts. The majority of mild TBIs resolve within 7, at most 90 days. But there is a miserable minority of TBIs, those that don't resolve, and those that have persistent concussion syndromes throughout the entire life of the victim. So this is normally the playing field we have with somebody with a mild TBI, and it's going to be an uphill battle. So every single piece of equipment you can use, you're well served to use it. So remember this, for a mild TBI, most symptoms are subjective, and the diagnosis generally hinges on 2 things: the patient's self-report and whether the observations by the physician and others are consistent. What that tells us is a lot of times these come down to credibility. So our client is going to say, I have headaches, I have memory problems, I have difficulty with vision. There's a whole array of subjective symptoms that the defense will be very skilled at trying to exploit and say, Dr. X, you diagnose a concussion, you diagnose a mild traumatic brain injury. And for those who don't know, the term concussion and mild traumatic brain injury are pretty much synonymous, but that's based on the subjective symptoms. So if the patient is lying to you, making this up, then it would change your diagnosis if these symptoms are not reported to you. And the answer is normally yes. And I will tell you this, I'm facing that in a case right now where one of my clients goes and 6 days after the incident reports all these symptoms, and the defense is pointing out, well, it's very convenient that, 6 days later, he's reporting all the symptoms known to be a mild TBI, he's probably lying. Well, he's not, and we'll prove it in the case. But keep in mind that that is probably the uphill battle you're going to face. Now, TBIs are special, especially the MTBIs. And remember this quote, it actually comes out of the medical literature. Distinct from other medical disorders, individuals who sustain a mild TBI are often faced with a unique obstacle to treatment. Compare the individual who has suffered a brain injury to one who has suffered a stroke from an incident. Unlike the patient with a stroke, where treatment is instituted immediately without doubting the veracity of the complaint, there is independent evaluation and questioning of the TBI injury and the presence of symptoms. And this is what the medical literature describes as a problem with deal with MTBIs. And if you like that language, there's actually a piece of peer-reviewed literature you can always cite to. It's called Effort, Exaggeration, and Malingering After Concussion by Jonathan Silver in 2012. And by the way, defense experts and defense firms love to use this piece of literature. So next time they use it against you, also remind them of that and cite it. And their experts will have to agree to that because it's going to set the stage for the difficulty of getting treatment and diagnosis in your mild traumatic brain injury. So when I say the term mild traumatic brain injury, we're going to be very cautious because, again, it's misleading. It's a misnomer. Mild traumatic brain injury used to be thought as a relatively inconsequential mild injury. For years, concussions were no big deal. People go back to playing sports and get on with their lives without a problem. But that has now changed. Nowadays, an MTBI is most closely associated with the last 3 letters of the acronym, which is a traumatic brain injury. And this shift in understanding is due to a lot of research that's happened since probably 9/11, when the military really funded after the Gulf War a lot of research into concussions, because they had all these soldiers coming back and had these symptoms that just wouldn't go away. So a lot of money gets poured into this. We have a whole new line of research, and that opens up the floodgates of new modalities, new treatments, and also new ways to diagnose this injury. And the research has shown that a single or multiple TBIs can actually cause structural visible damage to the brain. And that's very important, because normally we're in a situation where we have a patient or a client, a victim, who complains of all these symptoms. But you look at their brain and they look fine. You look at them and they look fine. And it's something that we've always talked about in these seminars, that it's an invisible injury. And it's really hard to prove to a jury that this invisible injury is real, that what they don't see is actually happening. So think of an analogy. Consider a back MRI. When you have a back MRI, normally the everyday person doesn't get one just as preventative care. It's only ordered when there's an incident that happens, when there's pain, when there's a subjective, disorder, something. And what that MRI would technically show us, if there's pain normally, is, well, there's a bulging disc or a herniating disc or something to that effect. So now we have an image that shows there's actually structural, organic injury to the body that is causing this pain. We can now address it medically in different ways. Well, the brain works exactly the same way. We need to be able to prove our cases a lot of times to show that there is actually an organic injury that is happening to the brain. The brain is an organ. It can be injured as well. And when you put up a MRI of a back with a bulging disc, normally the conversation changes from, well, that's not really a back injury, to, well, it was there before, it wasn't caused by us, it was made worse by you, things of that nature. And the imaging techniques in brain injury help us shift the conversation the same way, so that you don't have the same exact problems that we had in the past. So the adage is, seeing is believing. Use every tool you have at your disposal to show that there's an organic injury to the brain. This is not just going on in somebody's head. And just so you know, there's a lot of new literature out there in research that's starting to show, or they want to project the idea that, well, people are malingering. Well, that's been pretty much debated very much. And you can beat that back with literature as well, pain symptoms, things like that. There's a new line, and again, it goes back to a Silver article, and they say, well, people are not intentionally malingering, but their symptoms are a result of things going on in their head, anger, revenge, they feel bad. What they try to do is discount your symptoms, trying to say, look, we know that most concussions resolve in 90 days, yours hasn't resolved. Yes, there's a chance you could be in the miserable minority, but it could also be a chance that your symptoms you're reporting are the result of things going on in your head, because you're angry, you want revenge, things of that nature. Again, if you're able to show the organic injury to the brain, it changes the conversation. Now they can come back and say it was there before, or it's not what it is, but it changes your conversation to your client is just making it up. So considering this uphill battle, you have to be aware that there's another wrinkle, mostly in MTBI cases. And what I mean by that is nobody is perfect, and the demographics are what they are. Most people who are going to come to our offices are going to be probably overweight, may have diabetes in some form or shape, may have ADHD, may have hypertension. All these, they're going to have they may have depression, they may have some form of PTSD. All these are going to compound the difficulties in your brain injury case a lot of times. And it's great for the defense, because they will try to mislead a jury into blaming all these other issues and say, listen, these are pre-existing. This is what was before we had the accident. It should result in 90 days. And guess what? The symptoms are the same as before the accident. So therefore, he doesn't have a long-term concussion. He doesn't need care. And by the way, he's going to be just fine. Award him $0. And now your client is left in an injured situation without the medical care he needs, and without the compensation that he's entitled to. So when you look at these pre-existing issues, which is another problem with MTBI, there's two ways to address it. First of all, the law allows us to use what's called the actual plaintiff theory. Okay, you pretty much, if somebody was predisposed to be injured and you injure them, you kind of buy it as they come. Well, the literature actually supports that, especially when it comes to mild traumatic brain injury. The literature tells us that pre-existing mental health issues are actually risk factors. So what I'm telling you is don't run away from them, embrace them, because the literature is going to tell you that if you suffer a mild TBI, yes, it should resolve in 90 days. And yes, there's a minority of people who it doesn't resolve for and it becomes lifelong. But if you have risk factors such as depression, PTSD, ADHD, all these other things, that makes you more likely to be in the category of people who are not going to recover from a traumatic brain injury. So what the medical literature calls it is an incomplete or a delayed recovery. So don't run away from them. But be cautious, because the defense is going to point out, wait, all the symptoms that you find here are available with the pre-existing condition. So how do you tease them out? How do you explain that what you have is an organic injury to the brain for a jury? And based of all, how do you do with a picture? Well, that's where the MEG comes in. Because the studies have shown that MEG has great utility in detecting a traumatic brain injury. Why? Because it looks at the brain cognitivity and abnormalities that TBI is associated with. It correlates brain signals with post-concussive symptoms, and it could differentiate TBI from things such as PTSD, and that is invaluable. It can also monitor the response to TBI treatments. And the benefit of that is that the treating healthcare providers can then say, okay, we tried this modality. It's not working. We're going to try this modality now. And they have an actual scientific test that can do this. Now, here's a word of caution. It's not in clinical use yet. Right now, it is in research use, which is why we can use it in litigation. Now, of course, the defense is going to argue, like they do with DTI, or they have tried for years, is it's not in clinical use. And that is correct. But just because it's not in clinical use does not mean you can't use it in litigation, because remember, it is a research tool used in the scientific community to investigate, diagnose, and come up with treatments for mild traumatic brain injury. But I will tell you this, the literature is growing on this, and we are pretty close to actually putting into clinical use. And I think at that moment, you're going to see an explosion of more use of the MEGs. So the paper that kind of sets it off is this paper called Magnetoencephalography in the Detection and Characterization of Brain Abnormalities Associated with Traumatic Brain Injury, a Comprehensive Review. And what this paper did is it looked at about 458 articles. And they theorized and said, wait a minute, the brain emits electrical signals. We can use magnets to figure out how it's working and how it should be working. And then we can also look at different brain conditions and psychological disorders, PTSD, depression, you name it. And can we find some patterns that we always see in those diseases? And they did that. And they said, okay, well, now we know that there's people who have a traumatic brain injury. Can we see those patterns as well? And they did a whole host of research on that. And then this paper kind of brings it all together. And from that is when we started using MEG now in casework, because it's been really beneficial, especially when you have complicated cases with imaging. So how does it work? Because at some point, I promise you, you do use an MEG, you're going to face a Daubert motion. And then you're going to be in front of a federal judge or a state judge who doesn't have the scientific background, who's never seen this before. We don't have the benefit we do with DTI now. DTI is well established, it's robust. I mean, we can cite to 100 articles, 100 case opinions that say DTI is admissible in almost every jurisdiction. MEG is new. So we are the battle that we had with DTI probably 20 years ago. So you're going to stand up in front of a judge and try to explain to them, what is this word that nobody can really pronounce? And we just call it a MEG for short. Well, a MEG measures the magnetic flux on the surface of the head and specifically looks at the electric currents in the brain. It kind of is like EEG, but it's better. And it's better because MEG is less susceptible to distortion caused by the tissue and the connectivity than EEG. So it is pretty much an improvement of EEG, and you can even use it in conjunction with an EEG. So remember this, when you argue, they say, well, judge, this is a magnetoencephalography. I highly recommend, price a couple hours, how to say it. You can say the word properly, the judge is more likely to believe it's a real thing. And you might get some credibility there. And you say, listen, judge, we all know we have electricity in our brain, electrical currents, neurons move. We use magnets to measure those currents and see how it's working, to make sure that there are no distortions in the patterns of our brain. Well, how does it work? Well, simple. It looks at a bunch of frequency bands. It looks at a data band. It looks at a theta band. It looks at an alpha band, a beta band, and a gamma band. And these different bands have different frequencies. When we talk, when we look at things, when we think, our brain, if we had an EEG or an MEG attached to those, would be lighting up in different ways. When we have pain, it would do the same. This is using those bands in order to analyze the functioning of the brain itself. So I'm going to share my screen right now. I'm going to show you a little bit of what an MEG report looks like as it's being taken. So Kyle, are you able to see my screen?
I can. Yep.
All right. So this is what it looks like. You can see the difference. MEG, EEG, ECG. If you look at that red arrow, you can see it's consistent on the MEG, where it's not on the EEG or the ECG. Again, there's distortion. That's what defense always says about the EEG. Well, there's distortion, you can't really make an assessment based on that. He has to have some findings. The MEG eliminates that. And it's going to come up this way with the brain waves. And from there, you're going to be able to take it and build it into a model. And now be able to show what the abnormalities look like in the brain. So, Kyle, are you able to see my screen?
I can.
So you take the MEG from those wave analysis, and then you can put it into a model of the brain. And as you can see, there are areas of the brain that are lighting up red, yellow. Again, you look on the one on the right-hand side, it looks a lot like DTI too. By the way, you can correlate MEG and DTI too. So once you put this up, you now have a map of the brain. And what you have now is evidence of what is called an organic injury to the brain. Then the question only becomes, is this caused by a mild TBI? So basically, do people who have mild TBI have these same type of findings as opposed to people who have PTSD and depression and other things? And we have a robust set of literature that actually tells us what DTI looks like, what TBI, what depression, what PTSD looks like. So that is a usefulness. Again, you're putting an image in front of a jury, you're able to show a judge, and you have an organic injury, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to prove, and therefore now your client can get the treatment that he actually needs instead of just being told, are you sure you have a brain injury? You sure you have memory problems? Are you sure that you have sensitivity to light? It eliminates that, and it's one more piece of your arsenal to be able to prove these cases.
Hey, Hugo, so I'm curious as you're talking about this. I know we've done a few of these where we've talked about diffuse tensor imaging and the use of it and when to use it. And I'm curious with MEG versus DTI, how you're making the determination of when to use what imaging as a necessary tool.
Well, DTI and MEG understand are two completely different utilities, okay? DTI measures the fluctuation of water molecules along the corpus callosum and the fibers of the brain. This measures the electricity in the brain and the brain waves. So DTI is great. It can show more than a regular MRI, definitely more than a CT scan. But we do know from the literature that roughly 60% of MTBIs were not going to show on a DTI. So then you're back to square one of, well, you have symptoms, they're persistent. How do you prove the injury, right? And also, DTI has the problem, and not really a problem, but there's literature on it that different kind of pre-existing conditions can cause difference in FA values. So DTI, when we do it, we look at what's called the fractional anisotropy. So are they high, are they low? Are the molecules moving faster in the different direction they should be, or slower than they should be? Both are bad for your brain. But PTSD, depression can also cause it. We don't have a history and research of patterns that can do it. So if your DTI is negative, it doesn't mean you don't have a brain injury. You might want to consider a MEG. If you have a lot of pre-existing conditions and you have a DTI that has positive, findings, you may also want to consider a MEG, because the whole point is you're trying to isolate what is actually causing these findings. And you can correlate your MEG to your DTI. Now, it's a little bit hard to correlate neuropsych findings to DTI because of brain plasticity, and because the fiber that's being studied is the corpus callosum. It's a pretty big fiber that goes across your whole brain. MEG is actually a little bit different and a little bit better for that, because the literature on it does correlate neuropsych findings to MEG findings.
Got it.
So when you're a neuropsychologist, as normally happens, test them and says, well, they have deficits in these 5 areas. The neuropsychologist tests them and says, yes, they have the deficits, but I think it's depression, it's, PTSD, it's, psychological. Well, the DTI isn't going to help you there, but the MEG will.
And are you finding that most imaging centers that are able to provide, diffuse tensor imaging are also able to do this?
Well, there's a rub. No.
Okay.
So, I'm not sponsored by them and I'm not paid by them,
Sure.
but I use the Monster Group out of New Mexico.
Got it. Okay. Familiar.
Yes, and part of the reason why I use them is the scientist who heads them and who actually does the MEG analysis and the MEG testing is Dr. Lee, who actually wrote the seminal paper on it.
Okay.
So it gives you a little bit of a built-in spread on that, because this is a gentleman who probably knows the most about coordinating MEG and TBI.
Excellent. Okay. All right. I appreciate you answering the question.
No problem. And it's actually a really good segue, because if you look at the Lewine paper that he published in 1999, that we always use in court and we use to get MEG admitted, what they did is that they compared MRI, EEG, and MEG findings in normal patients, in patients who had symptomatic post-concussion syndrome, and in patients who did not have symptomatic post-concussion syndrome, but they knew had suffered a concussion. And based on that, they started to develop this database and all this information, because now we have, okay, what does DTI look like in patients that are normal? What does DTI look like in patients who have symptoms of concussion continuing? And what does DTI look like in patients that have a concussion but are asymptomatic? And they did the same thing for EEG, and they did the same thing for MEG. And that is a real benefit of the literature on this point. So a really big part of why I like to use the MEG a lot is that the functional region in which the brain abnormalities occur for each patient actually were able to be correlated to cognitive symptoms. So frontal lobe abnormalities, slow wave activity with executive dysfunction. You can make a pretty close, almost one-to-one correlation. Caveat, there's a problem if you're left-handed. So if it's me, it's an issue. And it has to deal with the way your brain works, and it's wired once you're left-handed or right-handed. But since the majority of people are right-handed, it is very useful and beneficial for that purpose. Even with left-handed people, you can do it, but there's more literature out there on right-handed people. And there's a difference that neuropsychologists always tell you, left-handed people respond differently than right-handed people. But the whole beauty about this is you're now being able to correlate one-to-one the cognitive deficits found in neuropsych testing with the actual part of the brain that is injured, with the actual organic injury. It is no longer an invisible injury. It is no longer a, well, Mr. Kyle here says he's got headaches every day, memory problems, and, dysfunction to light and noise. No. We have an imaging now. We now have an MRI of the back with a bulging disc, and he's got the symptoms too. And we can correlate those one-to-one pretty closely, especially when it comes to neuropsych testing. So it is a really added benefit to your cases.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions?
Absolutely.
All right. So one person asked, you did say that Mindset was the group that does the MEG.
Correct.
Okay.
Mindset Research Network, I believe that's the official name.
Okay.
They're in New Mexico. I will caution everybody. They are very scientific. And I will tell you this, their research is what it is. You can send somebody out there that will basically tell you what they find, and they're not going to change their opinion. I have sent plenty of clients out there. They've come back and said, nothing in the findings. Sorry, you don't want to hire me. So if you're used to the regular doctor who gives you the diagnosis you want every time, that's not them.
Yeah. Okay, I got another question, and it's they're asking if a PET scan is an appropriate tool for a TBI diagnosis. What is the treatment for TBI or mild TBI?
So is it an appropriate tool for TBI diagnosis? It's another tool that can be used. It's probably not, the most frequently used. I mean, look, if you have your MRI and it's visible in a plain FLAIR scan, you're great, because that shows your organic injury right there. The PET scan isn't as commonly used. Normally we go to the MRI with DTI. Now, the treatment for mild traumatic brain injury, that's a very good question, because every brain injury is different and every person. So understand this, mild traumatic brain injury just means you lost consciousness for less than 30 minutes. You can have an alteration of consciousness. It doesn't mean you have a mild injury. You can have a severe traumatic brain injury and come back and be just fine, because it means you lost consciousness for a prolonged period of time.
Sure.
The mild does not refer to the severity of the injury, just the loss of consciousness, the way it's graded. So what is the treatment? Well, it's going to depend on a few things. It's going to depend on your pre-existing conditions. It's going to depend on what part of the brain was injured. So as you can imagine, if you hit your head at a high velocity accident and you have a whiplash injury, your brain, which sits on a body of pretty much gel-like liquid, is going to slosh forwards and backwards. To be cool, we call that a coup contra coup kind of injury, which means coup is the front and coup is the back, and you get injuries on both sides. So then you're going to have injury to those parts of your brain. If you are then spinning around, you're going to have an oscillatory injury, and your brain is kind of composed of two different types of materials, white matter and gray matter. And at some point, if those move really fast in different directions, there's going to be a tear in them, and that's going to be your axonal injury there. It's going to depend on what type of injury you have, what part of your brain is injured. And that is the value of neuropsych testing, and also the value of MEG, because once you know what type of injury you have to the brain, you know what the deficits are. So a lot of times when it comes to mild TBI, especially the prolonged ones, it's about treating the symptoms, trying to obtain neuroplasticity, which is recovery, and then coming up with strategies that are coping. So we've talked a lot about inpatient treatment, where somebody can go and learn coping skills and different treatments that will lessen the symptoms, allow them to basically go back to their regular life as much as possible. So if somebody's going to have, executive dysfunction, you're going to have neuropsych testing. It's going to tell you, okay, where are the cognitive deficits? Not all people have the same cognitive deficits. And I will tell you this, we run into this a lot in cases. I was just in a depot last week, and the question asked to my life care planner was, you done brain injury life care plans before? Yes. Well, have they all been in this range? And the response was like, no. So you agree that this one is unusual? And the response is absolutely not. Why? Because it's a different type of injury every time. and you're addressing the specific needs of the patient. Again, it goes back to the MEG. Why is it so great? Because you can figure out, okay, if this part of the brain is what's injured, we know how to treat that part of the brain. And we can try different things to treat that part of the brain. Same thing with the cortisol treatment. Now, there are going to be some standalones that you're probably going to have every single time for monitoring purposes. So you're going to have, consisting of neurology or physiatry visits because you want to check, the patient out. You're going to have probably a couple of different MRIs over 5 years every time, just to make sure there's no structural changes to the brain. Remember this, the brain injury doesn't really happens immediately, but it's not visible immediately. It is caused by cell death. Just like if you hit yourself really hard on your arm, you don't get a bruise on that very second. You get a bruise the next day. A brain injury is pretty similar to that. And that's why you'll see people suggest you don't do a brain MRI until probably 9 months after the incident, because you need time for the cell death to happen. But the cell death doesn't just stop. It continues happening, and it could be visible at a later time. You're probably going to have some continuing neuropsych testing. Why? Because neuropsych testing tells us what the abilities are if there's any cognitive deficits. So if Kyle has an incident and a brain injury, we're going to have some neuropsych testing that's going to tell us, okay, compared to a sample of other males his age, he is testing, in deficits in this area, that area, and this other area. And then years later, we can do another one. And in fact, in a lot of litigation cases, we do often do serial neuropsychs a couple of years apart, because it can tell you whether somebody has plateaued and means their injury isn't going to get any worse. And sometimes you find that their injury does get worse, and you can show with the neuropsych testing. Based on that, that's pretty much going to drive your care. There's a lot of other dimensions that may drive it as well. So the symptoms are going to drive, whether you have headaches, maybe Botox injections. But those, I think, are pretty much the staples of most mild traumatic brain injury. Remember, we're talking about the ones that have persistent symptoms.
Yeah. There are definitely more questions rolling in. I think what we're going to do real quick, though, is we're going to bring in Ginger. She's going to bring in some of our sponsors, and then we'll jump right back into it as soon as we finish. Ginger, all
Okay,
yours.
fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle. And Hugo, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. I see those good questions coming in as well. I can't wait to get back to that. But we're going to take just a quick break because I do want everyone to meet Ingrid with On Point Legal Nurse Consulting. Again, we rave about this company because they do such good work. And in addition to that, there's such an amazing team of experts there. Ingrid herself, I think, has been doing this type of work for like over 40 years now, which is just incredible. And I know you've seen her on a lot of our nursing home abuse webinars. We can't wait. We're going to be having her back again next month as well. But Ingrid, we are so glad that you're with us to tell us a little bit more about what you guys specialize in.
Well, first of all, I'm enjoying this a lot. A lot of the work that we do, especially my colleague Dawn, is helping locate experts to look at TBIs. And actually, one of the things we do is research. So, for example, when it comes to locating a specialist or a site to get the test done, there's actually an American clinical MEG society that if you go online and look at their website, you'll see sites throughout the country and ways to get a hold of some of these specialists. But, for example, looking for a neurologist that is used to analyzing these types of studies and dealing with TBIs. So research is one of the things we do, but we're sort of a full service, everything going from record retrieval and organization to merit screens and crons and summaries, simple thumbs up, thumbs down. I do a lot of them for the geriatric work, to location of experts specific to what you need and helping you figure out just what kind of experts you need via, a phone call. We do pain and suffering reports that John Romano has used us for. We're nationwide. We've been around for more than 25 years. I'm a geriatric clinical nurse specialist, so I manage all the geriatric cases. More than half of hospitalizations related to TBIs happen because of falls. And so I have a bunch of nurses, including myself, that are experts related to falls. And unfortunately, sometimes it's just a simple accidents, but sometimes it's related to poor care in an acute care to a long-term care setting. And again, assessing TBIs and things like that in the elderly can be different than others. And Hugo had mentioned, the predisposing factors of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, but it also can happen because of this trauma, PTSD and depression, and that these MEG scans can help figure that out too, and help rule out what's going on, which came first, the chicken or the egg. So it's fascinating science, and we're here to help. We love being part of this group, and I learn something every time I watch these. You'll see Dawn. We brought somebody new on by the name of Patrick Stonich, who's going to be helping me because we're so busy with all the work going on against long-term care facilities, et cetera. So we do group homes, assisted living, the whole thing, but also consult cases and expert location. So give us a try.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ingrid. And don't forget to put your information in the chat box, because I hope everybody watching will save your information so they could reach out to you.
And I did
they
just
might
send
have
Ginger
questions
the
along.
link actually to the article that Hugo brought up that can be used to understand this whole science better. It's a well done article. So
That is
we
great.
sent that if you would like it.
Absolutely. I'll include that link in the email that I sent to everybody after this webinar so they can go check it out.
Thanks.
So thank you for sharing that.
Okay.
All right. And now I see that Mr. Blue Edwards is here with us with HMR. We were so lucky to have him on with us the other day, but now he is back. So he could tell you guys a little bit more about what HMR specializes in. Now, you guys know we've been talking about them. They've been with us from day one. They've been huge supporters of Connectionology. John, Romano, and myself are so grateful for you guys. And I look forward to seeing you in Fort Worth, Blue. I hope you're going to be there. And anyway, thanks for being here with us today. If you can, tell us a little bit more about what you guys do over there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ginger. I appreciate the introduction. And yes, we are definitely going to be in Fort Worth, September 14th through the 16th for the Deposition Skills Seminar. If anybody's going out there, let us know over here at HMR. We like to do dinners and things like that for our attorneys. So anyways, moving on. Hugo, great talk today. I get so much feedback from attorneys where they've identified a TBI and they're like, okay, now what do I do? Right? Like, I don't know what to do. What's the path of care look like? So I think this is super important to cover. So it's good to see you. Kyle, I'm going to take this moment to brown nose a little bit. You look good, boss. I just got to say.
Thank you, buddy.
All right, moving on, guys.
Flattery gets you everywhere, man.
Who is HMR? So HMR Servicing, we are the premier funding source for personal injury plaintiff law firms nationwide. And I say nationwide because we currently operate in over 39 states. We really do specialize in catastrophic injury cases, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord damages, amputees, the full gamut, right? I want to touch on 3 offerings that we provide for our attorneys here today. First of all is going to be pre-settlement funding. So obviously this is a hard time for your client. They're, maybe the worst time in their life. They may have difficulty paying their mortgage or, child support, whatever it may be. We understand that. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the pre-settlement funding, where we could step in and possibly help your client. It is a case-by-case basis. So again, feel free to reach out. I'll put my info in the comments after this. Number 2, we offer case cost funding. This has become quite a hot topic as of late. And what is case cost funding? Experts needed to shore up your case, life care planners, whatever you need, to build your case and to be successful at the end for all parties involved. Obviously, that's the goal here. I've also had attorneys reach out to me, and they like to use the case cost funding piece, so they're not coming out of pocket, right? The firm is able to use those funds for anything else that they want, marketing, whatever it may be for the firm. But if you guys ever need help with that heavy lift, again, feel free to reach out. And last but not least, medical funding. like I said, we function in over 39 states, which means, we work with providers nationwide. So if you guys also, if you have providers that you like to work with and they're your go-to, docs or guys, that's great. We would like to work with them as well. So feel free to reach out again if you have any questions. Ginger, thank you so much. Connectionology, you guys are awesome. And I look forward to seeing you in Texas.
Thanks, Blue. I'm looking forward to it too. And I hope everybody will go to connectionology.com to check out all of the details, because it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be a lot of really small group like discussions where you're going to be put in front of one of your teachers, who's going to be John Romano, Dino Colombo, Satch Oliver, or Joe Freed. Those are 4 speakers, and you're going to be able to really kind of like learn from each of them. It's something I haven't seen in any other seminar across the country. This one's going to be super special. And again, Satch Oliver is our chair, but he's worked really hard on putting this together, and we're just going to have a good time. So I can't wait to see you. We're going to have a good time. Thank you, Blue.
Thanks, Ginger.
All right. I'm going to hand it back over to you, Kyle and Hugo, and
You bet.
you feel free to address some of these questions, but they're rolling in. They're good.
You got it. You got it. Yeah, we'll try to knock these out and then we'll let you get back to it. Okay, Hugo?
Absolutely.
All right, bud. Here we go. The first one, questioning if they heard you right, Lewine wrote the article looking at 458 articles on MEG.
Correct. He's the one who did the initial study where they looked at all these MEG articles.
Okay.
He did the initial research as well.
So I did the initial research on MEG and then wrote the article. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So when you look at, especially if you do like a PubMed search or a National Institute of Health search, and you look for magnetoencephalography and TBI, you're likely going to come across a whole host of articles written by Dr. Lewine and other people as well.
Okay. Another person asked, can you comment on QEEG and NeuroQuant as diagnostic tools?
Correct. Actually, I can. So QEEG is the quantitative EEG, which is different from your regular EEG in the fact that it is measured up against a robust database. So for all those who use DTI, you know that whenever you use DTI, the question is, okay, you have a difference here, you have an abnormality, but is it significant? And how do we know it's significant? So what places who do DTI and QEEG do is they have a robust database, 1,000, 10,000 people. And what they do is they have all these subjects, and all these databases exclude people who have depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, all those things, and scan their brains. And now that gives them a good source of what a healthy, non-schizophrenic, non-epileptic brain looks like. And now once I have Kyle's, DTI scan, I can compare it against that database and match it up with, people the same gender, 10 years plus or minus, ethnicity the same way. And now it gives you a more robust argument to say, well, we have a database, and these databases will range in number. And it's actually very important when you're using a provider for a QEEG or a DTI, figure out what database they use and how big it is. Because a good way to challenge your DTI is to attack the database. And the same thing goes for QEEG. If you have a small database of only 20 people, well, how scientific is it? If you have 10,000, 100,000 people in your database, you're able to find, a whole lot of subjects that are very similar to your client, patient, and therefore you have a better way of saying, we know that out of 400 other individuals, they're supposed to look like this. For example, in the QEEG world, it will be, okay, what do the wave spikes look like? Well, we know in 400 people who don't have MTBI, who don't have epilepsy, seizure disorder, it looks like this in this pattern. We know what it looks like in Mr. Kyle, so therefore we can make the assessment better. Now, that's what makes it a QEEG different from an EEG. And EEG, you're really looking at the temporal slowing of the waves, which can be correlated to some neuropsych findings. But again, the reason why I think MEG is a little bit better is because there's less disruption on it.
Perfect. Okay, this next one's kind of multi-pronged. So there was a question about the cost of a MEG scan.
Well, normally my answer is I have Kyle's money, so it's not cost is no issue. Just joking.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
They are not exactly what you call cheap. Okay, so it is going to be costly. You're probably going to find a provider who's specialized in this and who knows how to do it and has the research on it. Not just anybody who offers a MEG can probably be your expert in this case. You're probably looking at just the actual MEG, probably between $5,000 and $7,000.
Okay. Second part of the question was, what's the downside? If the result is negative, does that mean there's no injury? Do you have to disclose a negative result in discovery?
So, okay, so let's go with the first one. What's the downside? Well, if your MEG is negative, it doesn't automatically exclude it. Then we need to look at other reasons to why these symptoms exist. The driving force here is you have consistent symptoms, and you're probably going to have consistent findings on neuropsych. Could your MEG be negative? Well, by that, I'm pretty sure what you mean is that the pattern of waves is inconsistent with traumatic brain injury. You have to look at other reasons to why you have the symptoms then. I'm not saying it's going to automatically destroy your case, but it is a very sensitive test. But just like DTI, it doesn't catch everything. And then you go back to the symptoms and what's causing these symptoms. But I think it's a very good tool at finding organic injury to the brain, but it's not perfect.
Okay.
The second one, do you have to disclose a negative MEG finding? Well, it goes two ways. This is non-clinical care. This is not done in ordinary medicine. So you're not going to have a patient or client that comes in, you send them to the neurologist and starts treating them and orders an MEG. This is a scientific study separate and apart from what clinical care is. Now, it can be used later on to direct care to figure out if care is working, but you're not going to do it. Normally, you're going to have to hire this person as a consultant. You don't need an order for it. You don't need to, it's not going to become part of the medical records. Some people like to argue, well, it's a certified medical record. The reality is that it probably isn't because it's separate and apart. It's not part of the healthcare. So what I would always recommend people do, and the defense does this all the time too, and later on you find out about it, is that you hire them as a consulting expert. Almost every single jurisdiction in this country has a rule that says that consulting experts are not discoverable. Only your testifying experts. From the federal court perspective, you have to disclose your testifying experts. Consultants are hardly ever discoverable. And then you can have the test done and figure out whether it's something you want to use or not. You do have that potential ability to do. Remember this, we have a benefit on the plaintiff side, the defense doesn't have it. If I was on the defense side, I would love to get an MEG done on most of the plaintiffs because I could then attack a lot of these symptoms. But the problem is there's no way I can get an MEG without a judge ordering it. Most judges are not going to order a patient, plaintiff, what do you want to call them, to want to go a testing done that he's not using, the defense wants to use to spoof things. It's just not going to happen. It isn't. They're going to say it's way too intrusive. If they use an MEG testing, yes, you might be able to get them to say, well, look, they get their own MEG testing. The problem is the data is the data. So the same thing happens with DTI. If you're on the defense side, and I use DTI as an analogy because something we deal with a lot in brain injury is, if you're on the defense side and we know that 60% of the time DTI shows nothing, you might want to come in and say, I want a DTI in every single plaintiff, even if they're not using it, even if they don't have one. It doesn't happen. Judges won't order that. They're not going to order brain imaging. What they'll say is, give them the imaging, give them the scans, give them the data. And the same thing's going to happen with an MEG, more likely so than not, and probably 90% of the times. So you're not going to have that problem. If you hire them as a consulting expert, you're going to figure out what you want to do. I can tell you something that we are taught in the fellowship at ABOTA is that from the defense perspective, it's the vogue to not hire experts for testifying. You hire them for consulting purposes only. So I could hire my neurologist, my physiatrist, my life care planner, my voc rehab expert, and they can tell me where the bodies are buried in the plaintiff's side of the case. I can pretty much get a lot of their testimony in through cross-examination, and I don't give any validity to the plaintiff's argument if I'm on the defense side. On the plaintiff side, it's a little bit different for us because we have to prove the case. They could sit back and just poke holes in our argument. We have to prove it. And you'll see a lot of even TBI litigation lawyers that are very well known on the defense side are not going to disclose a neurologist. They're not going to disclose a neuroradiologist or a neuropsychiatrist. They do a better job using those tools to disrupt your case and create holes in your argument, and then get to say, ladies and gentlemen, I don't need to disclose an expert because it's not a real injury. So the answer is, you can just hire him as a consultant first, just don't hire him as a testifying expert.
Got it. I'm going to ask you one more and then I'll let you get back to it. This one says, can this tool be used for a person who's had 3 TBIs in 3 years?
So I'm going to give you the lawyer answer, yes and no. And the reason why is, if you have 3 TBIs, is I'm assuming in your question, and maybe you guys for clarification, Kyle, are you trying to figure out which TBI caused what?
That's a good follow-up question. That wasn't spelled out in the question.
So I'll try to answer my own question.
Sure.
So if they've had 3 TBIs, the question is going to be, do you have prior MEGs? That would be great.
Her answer was yes, by the way. She is trying to figure that out.
Okay. So good. First will be, hopefully you have prior MEGs, which you probably don't. Then the next question would be, do you have any prior neuropsych testing? Hopefully you do. And if you do, then again, remember, we can try to correlate the MEG to the neuropsych testing. And if we know that, accident number 3, I'm assuming this person has the last accident. Am I correct on that? So we're going to assume that this person has the last accident.
Right.
And I guess my follow-up question would be, is there a prior neuropsych test or a prior scan on this person?
Yeah, we're getting no scans. No scans.
What about neuropsych from accident 1 or 2? Ideally 2.
Yeah, looks like yeah. None from any.
Okay, so you deal with the third one. Do you have any neuropsych testing?
No.
None of that. Okay. Well, I always love a challenge. So the MEG is going to tell you that there's brain dysfunction. The neuropsych is going to tell you, you can correlate it to certain findings of dysfunction. If we could figure out which findings were from what TBI, we could then use it. You may be able to get neuropsych testing. And again, I would talk to your neuropsychologist, psychiatrist first about this. Again, I'm not a full-time neuropsych. So before the times of neuroimaging, the way we used to prove these cases was called the surrogate method. And I think it's still very powerful to prove it. And before MEG, right now, the surrogate method to me was a great way of proving a TBI case, because when it comes down to it, symptoms are reported, but you have to look at what is the effect that this injury has on a person. Because as we know from the Lee 1 research, there are people with concussions that are asymptomatic. And at that moment, again, you don't treat persons who are asymptomatic. You don't have any suffering if you're asymptomatic. So we really focus on the symptomatic people. And that's what MTBI a lot of it looks at, 90% recover. What that means is that they're asymptomatic. I mean, your brain doesn't actually recover and grow back new cells and neurons. So what you would want to do if I was this person is I might want to talk to as many people as I can that knew this person before and knew them after. And yes, wives are great, caretakers are great, but you all want to go a layer outside of that. You want to talk to the coworkers. You want to talk to the university classmates. You want to talk to the teachers at school. You want to talk to the people that he goes to the bar with, that he has, softball leagues with, for a couple different reasons. They're going to be less involved in it. So they're going to be less subject to missing things, because a loved one sometimes wants to see things that are not there. they're also going to be less subject to cross-examination. I mean, if Kyle gets injured and his wife is testifying about all his deficits and how much he's changed, the clear and easy cross-examination question is, Miss Kyle's wife, you're going to make a lot of money from this. And, this is all subjective. A person who works with Kyle, like Blue, or somebody who just goes into the baseball game with Kyle or sees him in a softball league, doesn't have a skin in the game. They don't have a dog in this hunt. So when they can come in and tell you, well, let me tell you how he's different. This, and this. And he wasn't like that before. And then you bring anecdotal evidence. Okay, this happened this time. Now you're building the entire case. I would take that information, maybe take statements, depositions, something, and now go to my neuropsychologist and say, can you test them? And can we correlate these testing to time periods? Hopefully you want to find people from before TBI 1 and see when TBI 1 happened, and find people after TBI 1. Are there any symptomatic differences in them? Yes or no? If they are, make a list of those. Then let's go to TBI 2 and say, okay, let's find people who knew him before TBI 1, after TBI 2, before TBI 1, after TBI 1, and before TBI 2. How was he like then? And let's make a list of those symptoms after the TBI 2. And go to a neuropsych and say, okay, we have these changes now. And then you get your TBI 3. And that's where it gets a lot much more complicated, because you got to find people from pre-TBI 1, post-TBI 2 for you now, and say, how's it changed? And then based on the neuropsych testing, which neuropsychologists can normally do this, is, okay, well, we have these findings. Now we have this testing. We try to correlate the testing to the findings. So yes, you're going to have a couple of things on the neuropsych test that are probably pre-existing the TBI 3, but there may be new findings. And those are what you want to use, and then bring in your MEG and say, well, we know, for example, let's use an example, bill pay, which is a test that neuropsychologists give. And basically I would sit Kyle down in a nice sterile room and say, okay, can you basically do these functions, which are pretty much correlated to being able to manage finances? Some people who suffer brain injury are unable to do it. Based on that, we know we have a situation. So if we have somebody from pre-TBI 1 with Kyle that says he was great at paying all the bills, keeping on top of everything, not an issue. We have it, after TBI 1, it says, yep, he still could do it. After TBI 2, yep, he was great at doing it. He kept all the bills on time. There was never late on a mortgage, never late on a phone bill, kept all the finances, didn't double pay the bill. That's fine. So then we get to TBI 3. And we find out that, hopefully, I mean, if you try and prove this case, now Kyle forgets to pay the bills. He forgets to pay the light bill. He overpays the light bill. He forgot to pay the car insurance. The car got repossessed because he didn't pay it. He forgets to deposit the checks. He forgets to take money at the bank. Again, all these are actually real life scenarios from cases that I've dealt with. So we know that we have now a problem with that part of the brain that controls that part of it. We can then link it to an MEG, and we know that it wasn't before. Now, also, you do have a benefit in 2 prior MTBIs, hopefully they're MTBIs, because the literature does show that each MTBI takes out your reserves and makes you more susceptible to an incomplete or not being able to recover at all from the TBI. So again, I would take it as a risk factor. And hopefully that sort of helps the person who asked this question as to what I would do with that situation. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
There we go. Yeah, no, that's perfect. There are some more questions rolling in, but I want to let you kind of continue your presentation. Our talk is kind of up to you.
So I don't have much more left, so I'll just finish up and then I'll open up to questions.
Yeah, you got it. No problem.
I kind of want to build up on something that Ingrid mentioned during the break about PTSD and depression. Because yes, a TBI can cause them as well. It's also a different pattern on it. And it's going to be in the long term. But what's important is that when you're looking at what is the main driving cause, the MEG can differentiate between those. So for example, anxiety, depression, apathy, changes in personality, dizziness, fatigue, headaches, irritability, sleep disturbances. You can attribute it to either or. That's where the MEG comes in, because you can clinically differentiate the both. And remember, PTSD you can probably treat medically. TBI, you got to treat the symptoms. You're not going to be able to cure the brain after neuroplasticity, and that happens only very early on. Also, when it comes to treatments, knowing exactly what's causing the findings is very important as well. And if you want any research on that, there's an article by Dunkley in 2015, which actually researched those two disorders, and there's different patterns to them. So it deals with synchronization of the frequencies of the magnets as well, in case you want science on that. So when we look at response to treatment for this, that's what I think is very promising, and we can use it, especially for those of us who work a lot in TBI and who have built life care plans. It helps us guide and change the treatment, because again, no MTBI is the same as another one. You want to have variability. You want to be able to adapt and tailor the treatment to the individual and the deficits. So one more thing I do want to say about DTI, because we've talked about it ad nauseum, is that there's a good bit of research on MEG and MRIs. And well, they're both imaging techniques, but they work together as well, because there is research out there that demonstrates that there's a variety of uses for MEG, especially detecting mild TBI. And it's great with MRI together, because now you can map the brain in more ways and better ways and have more correlations between the two. So you don't have to pick one or the other. Often enough, I will use both at the same time, because I think they get it has different frequencies of arguments and different modalities as well. And the science is growing on this. I mean, don't be afraid to use it. Of course, you're going to be challenged on it. It's fine. It happened with DTI when we first started using it. But if you look at it today, there's over 1,100 peer-reviewed published articles on PubMed on the use of MEGs. So there's a robust database on that. It is actually in clinical use, just not in TBI. So there is actually some clinical use of it as well. And that's actually all that I have, Kyle. So if you want to have some questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Yep, you got it. All right, let's get into it. One of the questions was that somebody wanted to try to get a copy of the Lewine article.
So I'll share my screen. I know that's already been put in the link. I can share my screen right here. I pulled it up from the National Institute of Health.
Yep.
Are you able to see my? Let me see. Share screen.
I saw it just a second ago.
Yeah, let me go ahead and pop it up right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, hold on. Let me pop it up right here. That's what happened. There you go. I actually pulled it up for this presentation just so I could have it. I mean, I have it in PDF as well, but it just makes more sense right here.
Well, and maybe what we can do is get after this Ginger to put it in a link somewhere.
Correct. And if you can see my screen right there, it's up there. It's called Neuromagnetic Assessment of Pathophysiologic Brain Activity Induced by Minor Head Trauma.
Okay.
And you'll see the first author is Jeffrey David Lewine, who is the leading researcher. For a lot of us who have done DTI for a long time and neuroimaging, Dr. Orison was actually a co-publisher of this article. We know he's since deceased, but he sort of was at the forefront of research on brain imaging with DTI.
Perfect.
So I wants it, and you can get it for free in the National Institute of Health PubMed search.
Okay.
Generally available. It's May 1999. So if anybody wants it, or if Ginger can throw the link in there, I'd be glad to email it to Ginger, but I think she already has it.
Okay, so we'll get that out. There was a question. Somebody wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on DTI, just kind of what it is in general, for those who are not aware.
Of course. So DTI is diffusion tensor imaging. It is a technique that looks at the way that water molecules move across fibers. So our brain is composed of a whole lot of fibers. The biggest one is called the corpus callosum. kind of extends to the entire length of the brain. And it's very well studied by now. The theory behind DTI says that if you put basically a glass of water, the water molecules are going to move in random patterns. But we know that if you put a straw in there, they kind of tend to move in the same direction along that straw. So we analogize the fibers as a straw, and we know there's water molecules in the brain. So what we do is we look at those water molecules and look at the pattern in which they're moving, whether they're clumped in too much together or widely separated. And that tells us what's going on with the fibers. So if you have inflammation of the fibers, they'll be very tight together, which is going to make all these water cells kind of move in a lot closer together and tighter and faster. Whereas they're kind of broken up the fibers, it's going to be a more random pattern, kind of like, a little bit all over the place. That's the science behind DTI. From that, tells us a rate of speed and mobility. We develop what's called fractional anisotropy. And that is what gets measured against your database. So basically you get, we call them FA values for short, and there are different areas of the brain that are measured along the corpus callosum. So we know that, I had a DTI done of Kyle, and his FA value of the, fornix is, 0.64. Actually, 1 is the most you can have. 0 is the least. The average is 0.5. Well, then we measure against a database of people like him and say, okay, is that 2 standard deviations away from the mean? And if it is, then we know that it's abnormal. And now we have to investigate why it's abnormal. But it tells us that there's a disruption in the fiber tracts that is not supposed to be there. And there's a whole lot of literature. Dr. Orison, who's now deceased, published a study on this quite some years ago, looking at 100 unarmed combatants. If anyone wants to know what that is, it's actually boxers and MMA fighters, and looking at their brains in DTI, and showed that even these people did not have these types of severe injuries, and they got consistent blows to the head. So for you to have this type of an injury, it's got to be something severe and pretty damaging to your brain.
Perfect. Thank you so much, man.
No problem.
Okay. We got another question. It says, please describe MEG's advantage over QEEG and the diagnosis of post-traumatic epileptiform disorder, absent seizures, or those seizures causing bladder bowel incontinence.
Oh, that's a big question. So that's really kind of outside my area of expertise, because I mostly just do TBI, and I'm familiar with the literature on MEGs and TBI. It does have different applications. I will tell you this, you would probably have to reach out to an expert and figure out there is a MEG pattern that's recognized in the literature as consistent with that disorder when you don't have schizophrenia or seizures, and then seeing if they can correlate that together. My focus really is on the MEG and the patterns in PTSD, depression, and TBI, and whether those patterns are consistent or inconsistent with the diagnosis.
Got it.
But again, if you want to reach out to some of the experts in the paper that's published there, I'm sure they have more than enough knowledge on the subject, and they'll be glad to guide you through it. I've just never had this situation happen to me.
Okay. And one of the last was actually John Romano chiming in. He said it was a subpar webinar at this point, and he wished it would have been more informative. So no, nothing but kudos, man. So as always, when we have you on, we run this kind of very interactive program. I think it brings a certain fluidity to what we're talking about. So we always appreciate you giving your time and expertise in the area. So,
and look, I just want to leave you guys with one thing that everybody who knows Dr. Aaron Bigler is a fantastic neuropsych. Recently, in a case we had together, his response was, if you have a patient complaining of something and you've tested them and they're not malingering, believe them and find the reason why that is. And it's the same thing for our clients. If they keep complaining of these problems, nobody really wants to be in litigation. Nobody wants to be injured. They want to get better. Believe your clients and keep finding ways so you can prove what's happening to them and get them the treatment they need. And I think if we do that, we do a great service to our clients and to society in general.
Yeah. Somebody snuck one last question in, then I'm gonna turn it back over to Ginger. Somebody said, do you find that many of your clients with TBIs also have related conditions such as heart disease, hypertension, PTSD? You posted a study, it's talking about heart damage associated after a TBI.
So again, it's going to vary on each TBI. There is some literature, not a lot, and that is linked some TBI to actually some heart conditions that happen subsequent. The question is going to be, when was it diagnosed? What is the actual heart condition? I mean, with depression, PTSD, TBI is known to cause that. So it's a bit closer linked to that. Heart conditions are a bit more separated, but even gastroenterology issues have been linked to TBI. I mean, your brain controls your entire body. You disrupt those fibers, and that's what's so important. The defense always wants to make TBI about headaches, I'm complaining about this, complaining about that. These symptoms, well, symptoms are there for a reason. And what the MEGs, what the DTIs, what the MRIs allow us to do is show that there's actually an injury, an organic injury to the brain. Of course, that's going to have effects throughout your entire body. It's not just Kyle sitting there complaining every month of headaches and I feel sad and, I'm not who I used to be. There's a reason why it's happening, and it's because there's an actual bruise, tearing injury to his brain.
Yeah. Fantastic, man. Ginger, I see you, I see you and Cody now. I love Cody. I've never met a guy with more energy, so I'm excited to hear what he's got to say.
Absolutely. We're so excited to have Cody with us today. And he's going to be sharing with you guys a lot of the great stuff that they do over there. They do amazing work. If you've had a chance to see any of his videos that he's been showing or any of his animations, I mean, it's truly one of a kind. And they also have a great team over there. We do a lot of work with them. But Cody, if you are there, I'm just trying to
Ginger,
find
can
you.
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Yeah, I don't have a camera function on here. It's the first time that's ever happened.
I'm going to try this again. 1 second.
You bet.
Let's see what we can do.
Because you were talking about DTI and stuff, and Hugo, I love this, man. So I have been okay. Join as panelist. Here we go.
There we go.
All right, we're on now. There we go.
Back in business.
There
There you are.
back in biz.
Thanks.
Yeah, so Hugo, man, I was looking at that MEG and I saw a portion of those scans, and I thought, man, if it looked very similar to the DTI. And I talked to Jeff Mitchell about that. I can't wait to, work with you guys on some cases. But I wanted to show you kind of what we're doing with the DTI. We've got something new that maybe you haven't seen, Hugo. And but I know after looking at that we can totally do it with MEG, and I can't wait to do that. But here's what we've got thus far. Are you guys able to see my screen and see that brain?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Hugo, what you were saying about the water molecules, this is from a normal library from the neuroradiologist. And then what we do is we zoom into the sagittal portion and we show the abnormal part of the brain. And so that's the abnormal DTI, and we highlight it. But then we're able to actually volumetrically model the abnormalities in the brain so that you can see it, so that you can actually, a person can really see, oh, wow, those are the injuries in relation to how big the brain is. It makes a difference, and it's shown in a way that's easily understandable by the lay. And so this was, and actually, Hugo, we're using working with the same doctors as you guys work with. And this got admitted into evidence because it's not an artist's interpretation of the abnormalities. This is a volumetric engineering reconstruction. But so we have a lot of fun, but I can't wait to I learned so much about MEG today, and really think what you're doing is awesome. So can't wait to work.
Work together.
Totally agree. And Cody, don't forget to put your information in the chat box so everybody can save that as well and then speak to you very soon, because like I said, we're just so impressed, and each time it keeps getting better and better. So thank you for all that you do, Cody.
Yeah. Thanks, Ginger. Good to see you. Kyle, you're looking good, man, by the way.
Thanks, buddy.
All right, Kyle and Hugo, back to you.
Okay, good deal. I think we just got this one last question, and then if you don't have anything else, Hugo, then we'll wrap it up for the day.
Shoot.
Says the reading of a study. It says, in our prospective study of 46 patients with moderate to severe TBIs, 6 patients, 13%, had developed cardiac dysfunction. 4 patients had mildly reduced. So it's more along the same vein of like other conditions that pop up with TBIs, and I think you've kind of addressed.
Correct. Studies are out there. You have to make sure there's a causation, not just association. And it's also going to depend, the strength of the evidence is going to be on the size of the study. Normally, one study itself isn't going to be sufficient. You want to have a cross-sectional analysis across a whole body of studies to be able to have this really strong causative argument. But look, it's a start.
That's right. And look, to put kind of a finer point on it, I think you've said it a couple of times in various talks. All of the things that you're showing are, a piece of the puzzle, right?
Correct.
It's something you use to correlate with other things that are going on, not just standalone neuroimaging. And I've always loved that you kind of do a great job of explaining, hey, this is one tool in addition to many others that you're going to use to help your client. And so, another great tool you brought forward.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, look, man, every time I think the questions are done, yeah, okay. So it's more of a statement. Just talking about the advances in TBIs today. So it's great. Okay. Well, Ginger, look, I think we are at the end of the program. So if you wanted to bring in Ted, you're more than welcome to.
Okay, I'm bringing in Ted right now so he can do the announcement of the coffee giveaway, which we look forward to on every single webinar. So I can't wait for him to share who the winner is today. And I just want to say thank you so much for doing this special giveaway. Ted, it is so great to see you. Thank you for joining us. We always know that when you pop in, it's going to be some good news. So if you could do the honors and let us know who the winner is.
Yeah, so I'm excited to announce it's Brian Turner out of Sacramento, California is our winner today. And it's not a name I'm familiar with, so I think it might be a first-time winner. So that's fantastic. So congratulations.
Fantastic.
Congratulations,
And it's good
Brian.
to see you again, Hugo.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted. Good seeing you too.
All right, Ted. Well, I guess it means you and I will be reaching out to Brian in a few moments. Make sure that we get all of that great copy sent to him. But Brian, thank you for supporting Connectionology and watching the webinar today. And Ted, thank you again for popping in. We always appreciate when you come in and do this for all of us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And also don't forget that if you didn't win today, there's going to be many more chances starting next week when we return with another great webinar. So be sure to stay tuned to connectionology.com. And then after this webinar, I'm going to send you guys a copy of all of our speakers and all of our partners' contact information so you can stay in touch with Hugo and Kyle and all of our amazing partners. They're incredible resources. As you could tell, Hugo is very knowledgeable in this subject. So please reach out to him anytime. And be sure to follow him because he's always such a great wealth of information, and stay in touch. So thank you, Hugo, for being here with us today. Thank you, Kyle. And do you guys have any closing comments before we head out?
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Always a great time to come back and present. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, until next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. We'll see you back here very soon. And again, big thanks to HMR for helping organize this with us. And then On Point Legal Nurse Consulting and Fox AE. We appreciate you guys. Take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.
I guess.